Bobby Miller froze mid-step on his front porch, his lunchbox clattering to the wooden boards as his eyes locked onto the small, trembling form curled against his door. The security camera's red light blinked steadily above, recording what no one would believe. It wasn't just any bear cub. This one wore a hospital bracelet around its tiny wrist. Jenny's coffee mug shattered against the kitchen floor as she peered through the window, her veterinarian's training warring with disbelief. Their 9-year-old daughter Katie, pale from months of chemotherapy, pressed her face to the glass with wonder she hadn't shown in years. "Mommy, why is it crying like a baby?" The cub's amber eyes met Bobby's through the storm door, intelligent and pleading in a way that made his chest tighten with recognition of desperate need. Inside, Katie's oxygen monitor began beeping frantically as her excitement spiked. "Get the camera," Bobby whispered, his hand trembling on the door handle. "Document everything." What had driven a wild animal to seek help from humans? And why did Katie suddenly look more alive than she had in months? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Miller family had weathered storms before, but nothing had prepared them for the hurricane that was Katie's diagnosis 3 years ago. Their modest ranch home at 1247 Maple Ridge Drive sat in the heart of Asheville's working-class neighborhood, where neighbors still brought casseroles during hard times, and everyone knew your business before you did. Robert "Bobby" Miller had spent 22 years fixing NASCAR engines before the sport moved its operations elsewhere, leaving him scrambling for work at 47. Now he serviced aircraft at Asheville Regional Airport, his calloused hands maintaining million-dollar jets, while his mind constantly calculated medication costs and insurance deductibles. The man who once fine-tuned engines capable of 200 mph found himself powerless against the microscopic enemy ravaging his daughter's blood. Jennifer "Jenny" Miller had been doctor. Jennifer Miller, once a veterinarian with her own practice specializing in wildlife rehabilitation. She'd saved countless injured animals, earning a reputation throughout the Blue Ridge Mountains for her gentle touch with the most traumatized creatures. But when Katie's white cell counts started climbing toward the danger zone, Jenny closed her practice without hesitation. The woman who had dedicated her life to healing animals now spent her days managing chemotherapy schedules and fighting insurance companies. Their daughter, Katie Rose, 9 years old, with her mother's compassionate green eyes and her father's stubborn determination, had been battling acute lymphoblastic leukemia for 3 grueling years. The treatments had stolen her auburn curls and rosy cheeks, but somehow her spirit remained unbroken. She spent hours sketching in her worn notebook, drawing fantastical creatures that seemed to dance off the pages with life she could no longer physically embrace. The financial devastation had been swift and merciless. Hospital bills exceeding $300,000 had forced them to mortgage everything twice over. Bobby's retirement savings, gone. Jenny's equipment from her veterinary days, sold piece by piece. The insurance company had hit their lifetime maximum 18 months ago, leaving them drowning in co-pays and experimental treatment costs that insurance deemed unnecessary. Their neighbors knew the struggle intimately. Harold Thompson, the 78-year-old widower next door, often helped with yard work despite his arthritis-gnarled hands. Margaret O'Sullivan, Harold's sister, would appear with homemade soup whenever Katie's appetite disappeared entirely. The community had rallied around the Millers, organizing bake sales and car washes, but good intentions couldn't match the relentless appetite of medical debt. The house itself told their story, paint peeling where they couldn't afford maintenance. Jenny's old veterinary office converted to a storage room filled with medical supplies and mobility equipment Katie might someday need. Family photos on the mantel showed a progression from joy to endurance, Katie's smile growing more fragile in each frame while her parents aged years in months. This morning had started like any other in their new normal. Bobby leaving for his pre-dawn shift, Jenny preparing Katie's medications, and the familiar weight of uncertainty pressing down on them all. None of them could have imagined that their carefully constructed routine was about to shatter completely, replaced by something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about hope, healing, and the bonds between species. Bobby's hands shook as he slowly opened the storm door, his 22 years of mechanical precision failing him in this moment that defied all logic. The bear cub, no bigger than a cocker spaniel, lifted its head with effort that seemed monumental for such a small creature. Its black fur was matted with morning dew and something darker that Bobby preferred not to identify. The hospital bracelet dangled loosely around its left front paw, the white plastic stark against the dark fur. "Easy there, little guy," Bobby whispered, crouching down despite every survival instinct screaming at him to retreat. The cub's amber eyes held an intelligence that made his chest tighten with recognition. He'd seen that same look in Katie's eyes during her worst days. A plea for help mixed with resignation that help might not come. Jenny appeared beside him, her bare feet silent on the cold porch boards. Her veterinarian training kicked in automatically as she assessed the animal's condition with clinical detachment that had served her well through years of wildlife emergencies. "Dehydration," she murmured, noting the cub's sunken eyes and dry nose. "Exhaustion. Those wounds on his side look recent, but not infected." The cub made a sound that stopped both adults in their tracks. Not a growl or grunt, but something eerily similar to a human infant's cry. The sound was so unexpected, so heartbreakingly vulnerable, that Jenny found herself reaching forward before rational thought could intervene. "Jenny, no," Bobby warned, but she was already lifting the cub, her experienced hands supporting its weight, as she had countless injured animals over the years. The creature didn't resist. Instead, it nestled against her chest with a shuddering sigh that spoke of exhaustion beyond its young years. "Mommy, what's wrong with him?" Katie's voice came from the doorway where she stood wrapped in her favorite purple blanket, the one that had traveled with her to every hospital stay. Her porta-catheter created a small bulge beneath her pajama top, a permanent reminder of her ongoing battle. Jenny's heart clenched as she looked at her daughter, pale and fragile, but with eyes bright with curiosity for the first time in weeks. "He's hurt, sweetheart, and very far from his mama." "Like me," Katie said with the matter-of-fact wisdom that had developed alongside her illness. "Can we help him get better?" The question hung in the morning air like a prayer. Bobby knew the practical answer. Wild animals belonged in the wild, injured or not. Animal control would have to be called. The cub would be evaluated, treated if possible, and relocated far from human habitation. That was the law, the sensible course of action. But as Jenny carried the cub inside, Bobby found himself following, rationality taking a back seat to something he couldn't name. The animal's trust was absolute and heartbreaking, its small body relaxing completely in Jenny's arms as if it had finally found what it had been searching for. Jenny's makeshift examination room was the sunroom off the kitchen, where natural light had once helped her assess injured wildlife. Her old veterinary equipment had been sold months ago, but she still had basic supplies stored in the garage. As she gently placed the cub on the old examination table, muscle memory guided her hands through a routine she'd performed thousands of times. "Temperature's slightly elevated, but not dangerous," she reported, more to herself than to Bobby and Katie, who watched from the doorway. "Heart rate strong." These scratches looked like they came from another bear, probably his mother defending territory. The cub lay still during the examination, occasionally lifting its head to look directly at Katie. Each time their eyes met, something passed between them that made the adults unconsciously hold their breath. It wasn't fear or wariness, but a recognition that transcended species. "He likes me," Katie whispered, taking a tentative step forward. "Can I pet him?" Every parenting instinct screamed at Bobby to say no, But Jenny was already nodding, her veterinarian's assessment overriding caution. "Very gently, honey. Just on his head." Katie's small hand, pale and thin from months of treatment, reached out with infinite care. The moment her fingers touched the cub's fur, several things happened simultaneously. The animal's eyes drifted closed with what could only be described as relief. Katie's breathing, which had been labored since her latest round of chemotherapy, seemed to ease. And Jenny felt something shift in the room's atmosphere, a settling, like puzzle pieces finding their correct positions. "He's so soft," Katie murmured, her voice carrying a contentment that had been absent for months. "And warm. Mommy, why isn't he scared?" Jenny had no answer. In her years of wildlife rehabilitation, she'd never encountered an animal, especially a bear, even a young one, that showed such immediate trust with humans. Wild animals were wary by nature, defensive when injured, unpredictable when stressed. This cub displayed none of those behaviors. "We can't keep him," Bobby said quietly, but his voice lacked conviction. "You know we can't." "I know," Jenny replied, but she made no move to separate Katie from the animal. Instead, she found herself studying the hospital bracelet more closely. The lettering was clear. "Luna, female black bear, do not approach. Property of Blue Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary." A memory stirred, distant but persistent. 2 years ago, she'd treated a pregnant black bear that had been hit by a car on the Blue Ridge Parkway. The bear had been heavily pregnant, frightened, and fiercely protective despite her injuries. Jenny had worked through the night to save both mother and unborn cubs, earning the animal's trust through patience and gentle care. The bear's eyes had been intelligent, almost knowing, with that same amber depth she now saw in the cub before them. "Luna," she whispered, and the cub's ears perked up at the name. "Oh my God, you're Luna's baby." The pieces fell into place with heartbreaking clarity. Luna must have given birth at the sanctuary, but something had gone wrong. The cub had somehow escaped, carrying its mother's identification, and traveled who knew how far to find the one human who had shown his mother kindness. "What does that mean?" Bobby asked, reading the recognition in his wife's expression. "It means," Jenny said slowly, "that he didn't find us by accident. He came looking for help and somehow knew exactly where to find it." As if responding to her words, the cub opened its eyes and looked directly at Jenny, then at Katie, then back to Jenny. In that gaze was a communication beyond language, gratitude, trust, and something else that made Jenny's breath catch in her throat. "Hope." Katie continued stroking the cub's head, her movements growing more confident as the animal's trust became apparent. "What should we call him?" she asked. "Buddy," Katie decided without hesitation. "He feels like a buddy." The first 24 hours with Buddy passed in a blur of cautious hope and mounting worry. Jenny had called in sick to her part-time job at the veterinary clinic across town, unable to leave Katie and the cub alone together. Bobby had taken a personal day, claiming a family emergency that wasn't entirely untrue. They moved through their house like people walking on ice, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter the fragile peace that had settled over their home. Katie hadn't left Buddy's side except for necessary trips to the bathroom, and even then she hurried back as if afraid he might disappear. She'd dragged her art supplies into the sunroom and spent hours sketching while Buddy dozed beside her, occasionally lifting his head to watch her work. The drawings that emerged were unlike anything she'd created before. Detailed portraits of bears in natural settings, family groups with cubs playing while mothers watched protectively. "I dreamed about him before he came," Katie told Jenny that evening as they prepared a makeshift bed for Buddy in the sunroom. I dreamed about a mama bear who was sad because she couldn't protect her baby. She kept looking toward our house. Jenny's hands stilled on the old blankets they were arranging. Katie's dreams had always been vivid, but since her illness began, they'd taken on a quality that sometimes seemed less like imagination and more like glimpses into something beyond their understanding. "What else did you dream, sweetheart?" "The mama bear wanted me to take care of her baby. She said he was special, that he could help people feel better the way dogs help sad people." Katie paused in her folding, her small face serious. "Mommy, I think Buddy makes the hurt go away." Before Jenny could respond, the doorbell rang. Through the front window, she could see the distinctive green uniform of North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. Her stomach dropped as she recognized Officer Sarah Chen, a woman known throughout the county for her by-the-book approach to wildlife violations. "Hide Buddy in the garage," Jenny whispered to Katie, but it was too late. Sarah Chen had already knocked and was calling out her official greeting. "Mrs. Miller, Officer Chen with Wildlife Resources. I received a call about a possible bear sighting on your property." Bobby answered the door with the forced casualness of a man trying to appear innocent while harboring a federal crime in his sunroom. "Officer Chen, good morning. A bear sighting? Can't say I've seen any bears around here." Sarah Chen was 35, lean and efficient with dark hair pulled back in a regulation ponytail and eyes that missed nothing. She'd been doing this job for 8 years and had developed an instinct for when people were lying. Bobby Miller was definitely lying. "Sir, we received a report from Mrs. Henderson next door. She claims she saw you carrying what appeared to be a bear cub into your house yesterday morning." Sarah's voice was professional, but not unkind. "I'm sure you understand that keeping wild animals, especially bears, poses serious safety risks to your family and the community." Katie appeared in the hallway behind Bobby, her blanket clutched around her shoulders. Even through her illness, she possessed a natural honesty that made deception difficult. "We're not keeping him," she said quietly. "We're just helping him get better." Sarah's expression softened slightly at the sight of the obviously ill child, but her duty remained clear. "Sweetheart, I understand you want to help, but wild animals belong in the wild. Even baby bears can be dangerous, and they grow very quickly into animals that can seriously hurt people." "He's not dangerous," Katie insisted, with the stubborn certainty of childhood. "He's gentle and sad, and he misses his mama. We're teaching him to trust people who want to help." Jenny appeared beside her daughter, placing a protective hand on Katie's shoulder. "Officer Chen, I'm a veterinarian. I've been treating the cub's injuries and monitoring his health. He's malnourished and traumatized, but not aggressive." "Mrs. Miller, I respect your veterinary training, but this is still a violation of federal law. Bear cubs may seem harmless, but they're wild animals with unpredictable behaviors. I need you to produce the animal so we can arrange for proper care and relocation." The standoff stretched for several seconds, 3 adults and 1 child caught between law and compassion. Then Buddy solved the problem himself by wandering into the hallway, drawn by the sound of voices. He looked up at Officer Chen without fear, tilted his head curiously, and sat down beside Katie like a well-trained dog. Sarah Chen had encountered hundreds of wild animals in her career. She'd been charged by protective mother bears, treed by angry boars, and bitten by supposedly tame raccoons. Never had she seen a bear cub display such calm, domesticated behavior around strangers. The animal showed no signs of stress, no defensive posturing, no wariness that should have been hardwired into its survival instincts. "That's not normal bear behavior," she said slowly, her professional assessment warring with protocol. "No," Jenny agreed, "it's not. But nothing about this situation has been normal." Katie knelt beside Buddy and wrapped her thin arms around his neck. The cub leaned into her embrace, making that soft purring sound that had become familiar to the Miller family. "Please don't take him away," Katie whispered. "He needs us, and we need him." Sarah Chen looked at the child, pale, obviously undergoing medical treatment, clinging to an animal that by all rights should have bitten her by now. She thought about the call from Mrs. Henderson, who had been breathless with concern about dangerous wild animals threatening the neighborhood. She thought about her obligation to enforce wildlife protection laws designed to keep both animals and humans safe. Then she thought about her own daughter, lost to cancer 5 years ago at the age of 7. "Mrs. Miller," she said carefully, "what exactly is wrong with your daughter?" "Acute lymphoblastic leukemia," Bobby answered when Jenny couldn't find her voice. 3 years we've been fighting it. She's running out of treatment options." Sarah knelt down to Katie's level, her official demeanor softening. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Katie Rose Miller. I'm 9, but everybody says I'm smart for my age because being sick makes you think about grown-up things." Katie's honesty was heartbreaking in its simplicity. "Katie Rose, that's a beautiful name. Can you tell me about Buddy here? How long has he been with your family?" "Just since yesterday, but it feels like longer. He makes me feel better when the medicine makes me sick. Not better like magic," Katie added quickly, apparently sensing the need for clarification. "Better like when Daddy hugs me and the scared feeling goes away." Sarah Chen had been prepared to enforce regulations, file reports, and arrange for the cub's immediate removal to a proper wildlife facility. She had not been prepared for this. A dying child finding comfort with an animal that showed impossible trust. A family walking the tightrope between hope and heartbreak, and her own memories of desperate late-night prayers for miracles that never came. "Mrs. Miller, I need to ask you something directly. Has this cub shown any aggressive behavior? Any signs that he might pose a danger to your daughter or your community?" Jenny shook her head. "None whatsoever. If anything, he's been protective of Katie. When she had a coughing fit yesterday, he positioned himself between her and the door as if he was guarding her." "And you're monitoring his health professionally?" "Every few hours. Temperature, heart rate, appetite, behavior patterns. He's eating well, showing normal energy levels for a cub his age, and his injuries are healing cleanly." Sarah Chen made a decision that would have surprised her supervisor and probably violated several regulations. "I'm going to give you 72 hours, she said quietly. 72 hours to find a permanent solution that keeps this cub safe while allowing your daughter to have whatever comfort he provides." Bobby's relief was visible. "Officer Chen, we can't thank you enough." "Don't thank me yet. If I get another complaint or if there's any sign that this situation has become unsafe, I'll have to take immediate action. And Mrs. Miller," she turned to Jenny, "I want daily reports on that cub's condition. Any changes in behavior, any signs of illness or aggression, you call me immediately." As Sarah Chen walked back to her patrol vehicle, she found herself hoping she'd made the right choice. In her rear-view mirror, she could see Katie and Buddy sitting together on the front porch, the child's small hand resting on the cub's head while he seemed to watch the sunrise with unusual intensity. 3 days to find a miracle, she thought. God help them all. God. The miracle began quietly, the way most profound changes do, with a detail so small that it almost went unnoticed. On the morning of their second day with Buddy, Katie woke up without nausea for the first time in 6 weeks. She sat up in bed, blinked in surprise, and announced to Jenny that she was hungry for pancakes. Jenny had made countless breakfasts during Katie's illness, most of which went untouched or resulted in immediate trips to the bathroom. She'd learned to keep expectations low and always have crackers and ginger ale within reach. But this morning, Katie not only ate 2 full pancakes but asked for seconds, her appetite seemingly restored overnight. "Must be all the excitement," Bobby said, watching his daughter with cautious hope. "Kids always feel better when they're distracted by something fun." But Jenny, trained to observe the subtle signs of health and illness, noticed more than improved appetite. Katie's color was better, not dramatically, but enough that the grayish pallor that had become their normal seemed to have lifted slightly. Her breathing was easier, requiring fewer of the conscious efforts that had marked her difficult days. Most remarkably, the dark circles under her eyes had faded. "Honey, how do you feel today?" Jenny asked, trying to sound casual while mentally cataloging every positive change. "Different," Katie said thoughtfully, stroking Buddy's head as he lay beside her chair. "Like when you're getting over being sick with a cold, and you don't realize you feel better until you notice you can breathe through your nose again." The comparison sent a chill through Jenny. Katie hadn't felt better in any measurable way for months. Her illness had been a steady decline punctuated by brief plateaus, never by improvement. Yet here she was, describing exactly what recovery felt like. By mid-morning, word had begun to spread through their neighborhood with the efficiency that only small communities possess. Mrs. Henderson, despite her earlier concerns about dangerous wildlife, had become curious about the unusual calm that seemed to surround the Miller house. Harold Thompson, their elderly neighbor, hobbled over around 10 o'clock to check on the family he'd been quietly helping for months. Harold was 78 years old, a veteran of Vietnam who'd returned home with shrapnel in his left leg and arthritis that had progressively worsened over the decades. Some mornings, the pain was so severe that he could barely make it from his bed to his kitchen. He'd been managing his condition with a combination of prescription medications, stubbornness, and the kind of stoic acceptance that his generation wore like armor. "Heard you folks had some excitement yesterday," Harold said, settling carefully into one of the porch chairs that Bobby had positioned for him. The movement was clearly painful, each adjustment accompanied by the small grunts and sighs of a body that no longer obeyed its owner's will. Katie emerged from the house with Buddy trailing behind her, and Harold's eyes widened at the sight of the bear cub. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured. "He's smaller than I expected." "Harold Thompson language," Jenny scolded gently, but she was smiling. Harold's occasional profanity had become a comforting constant in their world of uncertainty. "Sorry," Katie rose, "but look at that little fellow, calm as can be." Harold leaned forward with interest, his arthritis momentarily forgotten in his fascination with the cub. Buddy approached Harold with the same fearless curiosity he'd shown everyone in the Miller family. The cub sniffed at Harold's outstretched hand, then did something unexpected. He gently licked the swollen knuckles that arthritis had twisted into painful knots. Harold jerked his hand back instinctively, then stared at his fingers with surprise. That's strange," he said slowly. "The pain just lessened." "What do you mean?" Jenny asked, her veterinarian's training making her automatically skeptical of subjective pain reports. Harold flexed his fingers experimentally, his eyes widening. "I mean the constant ache I've had for 15 years just got quieter, like someone turned down the volume on it." He looked at Buddy with newfound respect. "What kind of bear did you say this was?" Before anyone could answer, Buddy had moved closer to Harold, placing his small paws on the old man's leg where the Vietnam shrapnel had left permanent damage. Harold sucked in a sharp breath, then sat very still, his face cycling through expressions of surprise, hope, and disbelief. "Harold?" Jenny's voice carried the concern of someone who'd watched too many people struggle with false hope. "Jenny," Harold said quietly, "I haven't been able to stand up from a chair without using my arms for support in over a decade." He placed his hands flat on his thighs and with movements that seemed to surprise him as much as everyone else, rose to his feet smoothly. The silence that followed was profound. Harold stood for a moment, testing his weight on legs that had betrayed him for years, then took several steps without the careful, measured gait that arthritis had forced upon him. "This isn't possible," Jenny whispered, but her eyes were cataloging evidence that contradicted her statement. Harold's posture was straighter, his movements more fluid, his entire bearing transformed from that of a man carrying constant pain to someone who had been granted unexpected reprieve. Bobby, ever practical, tried to find rational explanations. Maybe it's psychological. You know, the power of suggestion, placebo effect. "Bobby," Harold interrupted, his voice filled with wonder, "I just walked across your porch without limping for the first time since 1973. Placebo effect doesn't cure arthritis." Word spread through the neighborhood with the speed of wildfire. By afternoon, a steady stream of visitors had begun arriving at the Miller house. It started with Harold calling his sister Margaret, who arrived within the hour despite her own health struggles. Margaret O'Sullivan was 82 years old and had been battling pancreatic cancer for 8 months. The prognosis was grim. Pancreatic cancer was notoriously aggressive and resistant to treatment. Her oncologist had given her weeks, possibly months, to live. She moved slowly, supported by a walker, her once robust frame now fragile and bent. "I had to see for myself," she told Jenny as Bobby helped her settle into a chair in their living room. "Harold called me talking nonsense about miracle bears and arthritis cures, but I've known my brother for 82 years, and I've never heard him sound so alive." Margaret's interaction with Buddy was different from Harold's. The cub seemed to sense the severity of her condition and approached with unusual gentleness. He laid his head against her stomach where the tumor was growing and remained there for nearly 10 minutes while the adults watched in fascination and growing concern. "Is he supposed to be doing that?" Margaret asked, but there was no fear in her voice. "It feels warm. Not uncomfortable warm, just soothing." Jenny monitored both Margaret and Buddy carefully, ready to intervene if either showed signs of distress. But the opposite occurred. Margaret's labored breathing eased, her color improved slightly, and for the first time in months, she reported that the constant nausea from her condition had subsided. "I don't want to get anyone's hopes up," Margaret said carefully, "but I feel more like myself than I have since this whole nightmare started." By evening, word had reached beyond their immediate neighborhood. Jenny's phone began ringing with calls from people she hadn't heard from in years. Former clients from her veterinary practice, fellow parents from Katie's school, members of their church congregation. Everyone had heard some version of the story, and everyone wanted to know if it was true. "Dr. Miller," the caller said, using Jenny's former title. "This is Patricia Walsh. My grandson has cerebral palsy, and I heard that you might be able to help." The calls continued through the night. Parents of sick children, elderly people managing chronic conditions, caregivers desperate for any option that conventional medicine hadn't provided. Each call broke Jenny's heart a little more, because she had no answers to give them. "We can't make promises," she found herself repeating. "We don't understand what's happening ourselves. This could be coincidence or temporary or—" But even as she spoke the words, she was watching Katie play with Buddy in the living room. Her daughter was more animated than she'd been in months, her movements less careful, her laughter more frequent. And Margaret O'Sullivan had just asked Bobby if she could stay for dinner, the first time she'd expressed interest in food in weeks. The next morning brought both validation and complication. Harold arrived early, walking with a spring in his step that made him look 20 years younger. Margaret, who had slept in the Millers' guest room, reported the best night's sleep she'd had since her diagnosis, and Katie's routine blood work, drawn by Jenny using supplies from her old veterinary practice, showed improvements that defied medical explanation. "Her white cell count has dropped by 60%, Jenny told Bobby in the privacy of their bedroom. That's not possible with her current treatment protocol. What does it mean? It means either our testing equipment is malfunctioning or Katie is experiencing a remission that shouldn't be happening. Jenny's voice carried the tremor of someone afraid to hope. Bobby, I've seen spontaneous remissions before, but not like this. Not this dramatic. The validation came with consequences. By mid-morning, cars were parked along their street as far as they could see. People had started arriving before dawn, some local, others from hours away, all drawn by rumors and desperate hope. They set up lawn chairs and makeshift camps, turning the quiet residential street into something resembling a pilgrimage site. Mrs. Henderson, their concerned neighbor, arrived with a thermos of coffee and an apologetic expression. "Jenny, I'm sorry about calling the wildlife officer. I had no idea." She gestured toward the growing crowd. "Is it true? Is that little bear really helping people?" Jenny looked out her window at the faces gathered in her yard, young parents holding sick children, elderly people supporting each other, caregivers who looked as exhausted as she felt most days. Each face carried the same expression she recognized from her own mirror, the desperate hope of someone who had run out of conventional options. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't know what's happening or why, but I can't turn these people away." The crowd grew throughout the day. Local news crews arrived, drawn by reports of unusual activity and persistent rumors about miraculous healings. By afternoon, the story had been picked up by regional news outlets, and Jenny found herself fielding calls from reporters asking questions she couldn't answer. "Mrs. Miller, can you confirm that your bear cub has healing powers?" "We're not claiming any special powers," Jenny replied carefully. "We're simply observing that some people report feeling better after interacting with him. But Harold Thompson claims his arthritis is completely gone. Margaret O'Sullivan says her cancer symptoms have improved dramatically. These aren't minor improvements." Jenny looked through her window at Buddy, who was lying in the shade while Katie drew his portrait for the dozenth time. He looked like exactly what he was, a young, wild animal who had found safety and care with a human family. There was nothing obviously magical about him, nothing that suggested powers beyond those of any healthy bear cub. Yet she couldn't deny what she was witnessing. Harold was indeed moving without pain for the first time in decades. Margaret had eaten 3 full meals and reported energy levels she hadn't experienced in months. Katie was showing signs of improvement that her oncologist would never believe without seeing the test results personally. And the people kept coming, carrying their hopes and their burdens, all seeking the same impossible thing, a miracle in the form of a small black bear who seemed to understand human suffering in ways that defied everything Jenny thought she knew about animal behavior. As the sun set on their 3rd day with Buddy, Jenny realized that their 72-hour reprieve from Officer Chen was rapidly running out, and she had no idea how to explain any of what was happening to the authorities, the media, or even herself. The siege began at dawn on day 4. Jenny woke to the sound of car doors slamming and voices carrying across the morning air, not the gentle murmur of their neighbors, but the urgent tones of people who had traveled far and waited long for their chance at hope. She peered through her bedroom curtains to see a line of vehicles stretching down Maple Ridge Drive and around the corner, their occupants setting up what looked like a small tent city on her front lawn. By 7 a.m., the crowd had swollen to nearly 200 people. Parents carried sick children in their arms, elderly couples supported each other with walkers and wheelchairs, and caregivers pushed medical equipment across grass that was never meant to bear such traffic. The atmosphere was part revival meeting, part emergency room waiting area, filled with desperate faith and barely contained anxiety. Katie pressed her face to the living room window, watching the gathering with wide eyes. "Mommy, why are all these people here?" Jenny knelt beside her daughter, struggling to find words that would make sense to a 9-year-old. They heard that Buddy helped you and Mr. Harold feel better. They're hoping he might help them too. But Buddy's just a baby bear, Katie said with the logical certainty of childhood. He doesn't know how to be a doctor. Before Jenny could respond, Bobby appeared in the doorway, his face grim. Local news is here, and Channel 13 from Charlotte. Jenny, we need to talk. They retreated to the kitchen, while Katie remained at the window with Buddy, who seemed remarkably calm despite the chaos brewing outside his temporary home. The cub had settled into their routines with an ease that continued to baffle Jenny's understanding of wild animal behavior. "This is getting out of hand," Bobby said quietly. "There's got to be 500 people out there now, and more arriving every hour. Mrs. Chen called. She's being pressured by her supervisors to remove Buddy immediately." Jenny felt the familiar tightness in her chest that had become her constant companion since Katie's diagnosis. What are we supposed to tell these people? That it was all a coincidence? That their hope is misplaced? "Maybe it is," Bobby replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe Harold's arthritis was going to improve anyway. Maybe Margaret's having a good week that would have happened regardless. And Katie?" Jenny's voice dropped to a whisper. "Her blood work shows improvements that shouldn't be possible. Are we supposed to pretend that's coincidence too?" Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door, not the gentle tap of a neighbor, but the authoritative rap of someone used to being answered immediately. Through the front window, they could see a man in an expensive suit flanked by 2 security personnel, all looking distinctly out of place among the camping families and news crews. Bobby opened the door to find Dr. Marcus Sterling, a name he recognized from medical journals and pharmaceutical company press releases. Sterling was in his early 50s, impeccably groomed, with the kind of confidence that came from wielding both significant wealth and scientific credentials. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller," Sterling said without preamble, "I'm Dr. Marcus Sterling, CEO of BioCure Pharmaceuticals. I'd like to discuss your bear." Jenny appeared beside Bobby, her protective instincts immediately triggered by Sterling's tone. "Our bear isn't for sale, Dr. Sterling. I'm not here to buy him, Mrs. Miller. I'm here to save him." Sterling's expression softened slightly as he noticed Katie watching from the living room. "May I come in?" "I think you'll find what I have to say illuminating." Against their better judgment, Bobby and Jenny allowed Sterling inside, though they insisted the meeting take place in the kitchen while Katie remained visible in the adjoining room. Sterling's security detail waited outside, adding another layer of surreal complexity to their morning. "Dr. Sterling," Jenny began, "if you're here to exploit what's happening with these families—" "Mrs. Miller, I'm here because 6 months ago my 4-year-old granddaughter Emma was diagnosed with neuroblastoma. Stage 4, the same type of cancer that killed my other granddaughter 3 years ago." Sterling's professional composure cracked slightly, revealing the grandfather beneath the corporate exterior. "I've spent more money than most people see in a lifetime trying to find treatments, cures, anything that might save her." "When I heard about your bear," he trailed off, looking through the doorway at Buddy, who had moved to lie beside Katie's chair as she worked on another drawing. "I had to see for myself." Bobby crossed his arms, his distrust evident. "And what exactly do you want to see, Dr. Sterling?" "I want to understand how a wild animal appears to be facilitating healing in ways that modern medicine cannot explain. More importantly, I want to ensure that whatever is happening here continues to happen in a controlled environment that protects both the animal and the people seeking help." Jenny felt a chill of recognition. She'd heard similar words from well-meaning officials before, offers to help that invariably resulted in the loss of everything being helped. "You want to take Buddy away for study?" "I want to create a facility where Buddy can interact with sick children and adults under medical supervision, with proper documentation of outcomes, and with the resources to ensure his health and well-being." Sterling's voice took on the persuasive tone of someone accustomed to closing deals. Mrs. Miller, you're a veterinarian. You understand that what's happening here needs scientific validation to be taken seriously by the medical community. What's happening here, Bobby said firmly, is that a wild animal found his way to our family during the worst time in our lives, and somehow everyone involved is feeling better. We don't need scientific validation for hope. Sterling's expression hardened slightly. Mr. Miller, hope without understanding is just wishful thinking. If this bear truly has some ability to improve medical conditions, that ability needs to be studied, replicated, and made available to as many people as possible. Keeping him isolated in your home is selfish. The word hung in the air like an accusation. Jenny felt its sting because part of her feared it might be true. Outside, hundreds of desperate people were waiting for a chance to touch a bear cub in the hope that their suffering might be eased. Meanwhile, she was hoarding that hope in her living room, rationing access like a precious resource. "Dr. Sterling," she said carefully, "assuming for a moment that Buddy does have some therapeutic effect, what exactly are you proposing?" "A partnership. BioCure will fund the construction of a specialized facility here in Asheville, close enough that your family can visit daily, far enough from residential areas to accommodate the crowds safely. We'll staff it with veterinarians, pediatric specialists, and researchers who can document interactions and monitor outcomes. And in return, we get the data, publishing rights to any studies. First access to any discoveries about the mechanism behind these apparent healings." Sterling's corporate mask slipped back into place. "Mrs. Miller, if this bear can truly help sick children, we need to understand how. That understanding could lead to treatments that help millions." Katie appeared in the kitchen doorway, having left her drawing to listen to the adult conversation with the acute attention that serious illness had taught her to pay to medical discussions. "Are you the man who wants to take Buddy away?" Sterling knelt to Katie's level, his expression softening. "I'm the man who wants to make sure Buddy can help as many sick kids as possible. Kids like you, and like my granddaughter Emma." "Is Emma very sick?" Katie asked with the matter-of-fact compassion that had developed alongside her own medical journey. "Yes, she is." "Then you should bring her to meet Buddy. But you can't take him away from us. He's not medicine you can put in bottles. He's family." Sterling stood slowly, his business proposal clearly complicated by Katie's simple wisdom. What if Emma could meet Buddy and all the other sick children outside could meet him too, but he could still live with your family? "How?" Katie asked. It was Jenny who answered, the veterinarian in her recognizing the logistics involved. "A facility that allows for daily interactions but provides medical oversight and proper animal care. Some place where Buddy isn't overwhelmed by crowds but where people can still—" She hesitated over the words. "Where people can still have hope." Before Sterling could respond, the sound of breaking glass came from the front yard, followed by shouting voices and car horns. Bobby rushed to the window to see that the crowd had grown beyond the capacity of their residential street. Traffic was backing up onto the main road. Tempers were flaring between people trying to maintain their places in an increasingly chaotic line, and several news crews were setting up equipment in neighbors' yards without permission. Officer Sarah Chen's patrol car pulled up with lights flashing, followed by 2 additional wildlife enforcement vehicles. Through the window, they could see her speaking urgently into her radio while surveying the scene with obvious concern. "Folks," she announced through a bullhorn, "I need everyone to return to their vehicles and clear this residential street immediately. This gathering constitutes a public safety hazard and violations of multiple local ordinances." A voice from the crowd called back, "We're not leaving until that bear heals our children." Other voices joined in, creating a chorus of desperation that carried the weight of months or years of failed treatments, insurance denials, and medical dead ends. These were people who had exhausted conventional options and were clinging to the possibility that a wild animal might succeed where modern medicine had failed. Jenny watched Officer Chen's face through the window and recognized the expression of someone facing an impossible situation. Chen couldn't forcibly remove hundreds of people without creating a dangerous confrontation, but she also couldn't allow the situation to continue escalating. "Dr. Sterling," Jenny said quietly, "how quickly could your facility be operational?" "With emergency permits and round-the-clock construction, 2 weeks, maybe 3. And Buddy would live there? He'd have a natural habitat area with climate control, veterinary care, and space to be a bear. Your family would have unlimited access. The public interactions would be scheduled and supervised." Bobby joined the conversation, his practical nature asserting itself. "What happens to our daughter's treatment during those 2 weeks?" "She's been improving since Buddy arrived. We arrange for daily visits transported by medical vehicle if necessary. Katie's well-being is our first priority." Katie, who had been listening with the intense focus she applied to all adult decisions that might affect her life, spoke up. "Can I help design Buddy's new home? I know what makes him happy." Sterling smiled, the first genuine expression he'd shown since arriving. "I think that could be arranged." Outside, Officer Chen was making another announcement. "I'm going to need everyone to disperse immediately, or I'll be forced to call for additional law enforcement assistance." The crowd's response was not cooperation, but a tightening of ranks, as people linked arms and began singing hymns, transforming their desperate vigil into something resembling peaceful protest. Jenny looked at her daughter, at Buddy, sleeping peacefully despite the chaos surrounding him, at the hundreds of people whose hope had become invested in a wild animal that had wandered into their lives 4 days ago. The decision felt impossible and inevitable at the same time. "Dr. Sterling," she said finally, "if we agree to this partnership, I want legal guarantees about Buddy's welfare, Katie's access, and our family's involvement in all decisions regarding his care." "Absolutely. And I want to interview every staff member personally. Anyone who works with Buddy needs to understand that he's not a medical device or a research subject. He's a living being who deserves respect and protection." "Of course," Bobby added. "And if at any point we feel this arrangement isn't working for Buddy or for Katie, we reserve the right to withdraw our consent." Sterling nodded, though Jenny caught a flicker in his eyes that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with that stipulation. "I think we can work something out that protects everyone's interests." Outside, the sirens of additional police vehicles could be heard approaching, and the crowd's singing grew louder in response. Time was running out for peaceful resolution, and Jenny realized that their decision would affect not only their family, but hundreds of desperate people who had pinned their hopes on a small bear who had simply sought shelter on their porch. "All right," she said, the words feeling both like surrender and salvation. "Let's try to save everyone." The tragedy began with a phone call at 3 in the morning, 2 weeks into the construction of what the media had dubbed the Healing Haven. Jenny jerked awake to the shrill ring of their landline, her heart immediately racing with the particular dread that late-night calls brought to families living with serious illness. "Mrs. Miller?" The voice was unfamiliar, professional, tinged with the careful neutrality that medical personnel used when delivering bad news. "This is Dr. Patricia Reynolds from Mission Hospital. We have Emma Sterling here in our pediatric ICU." Jenny sat up fully, instantly alert. Emma was Dr. Sterling's 4-year-old granddaughter, the child whose neuroblastoma had motivated his partnership with their family. Over the past 2 weeks, Emma had become a daily visitor to their home, one of the few children allowed to spend extended time with Buddy while the facility was under construction. "What happened?" Jenny asked, though part of her already knew. She'd been watching Emma during her visits, noting the subtle signs that her veterinary training had taught her to recognize. the gradual dulling of bright eyes, the increasing fatigue that no amount of rest could cure, the way the child's laughter had become more effort than joy. She collapsed at home around midnight. Massive seizure activity followed by cardiac arrest. We managed to stabilize her, but the doctor's pause carried the weight of prognosis too grim to speak aloud. Dr. Sterling is requesting that you bring the bear cub to the hospital immediately. Jenny's blood ran cold. Doctor, I'm not sure that's Mrs. Miller. This child is dying. Her grandfather is a major benefactor of this hospital, and he's convinced that your bear represents her only chance of survival. I'm calling as a professional courtesy to inform you that if you don't bring the animal voluntarily, Dr. Sterling has the legal means to compel you. After ending the call, Jenny sat in the darkness of her bedroom, feeling the crushing weight of impossible responsibility. Beside her, Bobby stirred awake, immediately sensing the crisis that had invaded their fragile peace. "What is it?" he asked. "Emma Sterling is dying, and her grandfather wants us to bring Buddy to the hospital." Bobby was fully awake now, understanding the implications immediately. "Jenny, we can't take a wild animal into a hospital. The infection control risks alone." "I know," she whispered. "But if we refuse, Sterling could use his influence to take Buddy away completely. And if Emma dies while Buddy is here—" She didn't need to finish the thought. The media attention, the public outcry, the legal consequences of denying a dying child access to what many now considered a miracle cure would destroy their family. They found Katie in the living room, curled up in her favorite chair with Buddy sleeping at her feet. She was awake, staring out the window at the construction lights of the facility being built in what had once been their neighbor's pasture. "I heard the phone ring," Katie said without looking at them. "Is Emma really sick?" Jenny knelt beside her daughter's chair, marveling once again at Katie's intuitive understanding of adult crises. "Yes, sweetheart. Very sick." "Are we going to take Buddy to see her?" "We might have to." Katie was quiet for a long moment, her small hand stroking Buddy's head as he slept. The cub had grown noticeably in the 2 weeks since arriving at their home, but he remained small enough to curl up like a large dog, his breathing deep and peaceful despite the chaos that constantly swirled around him. "Buddy's been sad lately," Katie said finally, "ever since all the sick people started coming every day. I think helping people makes him tired." Jenny had noticed the same thing. Buddy's interactions with visitors had become more selective, almost cautious. He seemed to sense the severity of each person's condition and respond accordingly, spending longer periods with the sickest individuals. After particularly intense sessions, he would retreat to quiet corners and sleep for hours, as if the encounters drained something vital from him. "Katie, we need to ask you something very important," Bobby said, settling into the chair beside them. "If we take Buddy to see Emma, there might be reporters, cameras, lots of people watching. Are you okay with that? Will it help Emma get better?" Jenny struggled to find an honest answer. "We don't know, honey. We still don't understand why some people feel better after spending time with Buddy. But Emma might die if we don't try." "Yes?" Katie nodded with the solemn gravity that her illness had forced upon her far too early. "Then we have to try. That's what families do for each other." The ride to Mission Hospital took place under police escort, a surreal procession that included their family car, Dr. Sterling's limousine, 2 animal control vehicles, and a media van that had somehow learned of their destination. Jenny held Buddy in a specially designed carrier while Katie pressed her face to the window, watching the early morning darkness give way to the harsh, fluorescent glow of the hospital parking structure. The pediatric ICU had been partially cleared for their arrival, with only essential staff remaining on duty. Dr. Sterling met them at the elevator, his usual corporate composure replaced by the raw desperation of a grandfather watching his granddaughter die. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice rough with exhaustion and grief. Thank you for coming." Emma lay in a bed that seemed too large for her tiny frame, surrounded by machines that monitored every vital function while keeping her fragile body alive. At 4 years old, she was even smaller than Katie, her blonde hair scattered across the pillow like spun gold, her skin translucent with the particular pallor that came from organs beginning to shut down. Dr. Reynolds, the attending physician, met them outside Emma's room with obvious reluctance. "Mrs. Miller, I want you to understand that I'm allowing this against my better medical judgment. The infection control protocols alone—" Dr. Sterling interrupted. "This bear has shown documented evidence of therapeutic effects in dozens of cases. My granddaughter has hours, maybe less. If there's any chance—" "There's no scientific basis for what you're claiming," Dr. Reynolds replied firmly. "And I won't have this hospital's reputation compromised by association with unproven folk remedies." The argument might have continued indefinitely, but Katie solved the problem by walking directly into Emma's room, her small hand firmly gripped around Buddy's carrier handle. The adults followed, their debate rendered moot by the determination of a 9-year-old who understood that sometimes action mattered more than protocol. Emma's eyes fluttered open as they approached her bed, fixing on Katie with the unfocused gaze of a child hovering between consciousness and coma. "Katie?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of medical equipment. "Hi, Emma," Katie replied gently, setting Buddy's carrier beside the bed. "We brought Buddy to see you." Jenny opened the carrier with hands that trembled slightly, acutely aware of the dozen medical professionals watching her every move. Buddy emerged slowly, his usual confidence replaced by an unusual wariness that seemed to reflect the sterile, threatening environment of the ICU. For a moment, the cub simply sat beside Emma's bed, looking up at the child with an expression that could only be described as sorrowful recognition. Then, with movements that seemed almost ceremonial, he stood on his hind legs and placed his front paws gently on the bed's edge. Emma's weak smile was heartbreaking in its trust and hope. "Hi, Buddy," she whispered. What happened next would be debated by medical professionals for years afterward. As Buddy leaned forward to nuzzle Emma's hand, several of the monitoring devices began registering changes. Her heart rate, which had been erratic and weak, seemed to stabilize. Her oxygen saturation levels improved slightly. Most remarkably, her brain activity, which had been showing the minimal patterns associated with deep coma, began displaying more complex waves. "That's not possible, Doctor," Reynolds murmured, staring at the monitors with professional bafflement. But as the minutes passed, Emma's improvements became undeniable. Her breathing became less labored, her color improved marginally, and her eyes began tracking movements around the room with increasing clarity. "Buddy," Emma said, her voice slightly stronger, "you came to help me." The bear cub remained perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on Emma's face with an intensity that seemed almost human in its concentration. Gradually, however, Jenny began to notice concerning changes in Buddy himself. His breathing became more labored, his usually glossy coat seemed to lose some of its luster, and when he finally stepped back from Emma's bed, his movements were noticeably slower and less coordinated. "Something's wrong," Katie said, her voice carrying the alarm of someone who knew Buddy's normal behavior intimately. Jenny immediately knelt beside the cub, her veterinary training kicking in as she performed a quick assessment. Buddy's temperature was elevated, his heartbeat was rapid and irregular, and when she looked into his eyes, she saw something that made her stomach clench with recognition. The same exhausted, pain-filled expression she'd seen in too many terminally ill animals over the years. "We need to get him home," she said urgently, scooping Buddy into her arms despite his increased weight. "Now!" Dr. Sterling, torn between joy at his granddaughter's improvement and concern for the animal that had facilitated it, tried to object. "But Emma, she's getting better. Can't Buddy stay a little longer?" Dr. Sterling, this animal is showing signs of severe physiological distress, Jenny replied firmly. Whatever's happening here is taking a devastating toll on him. Emma, now alert enough to understand the conversation around her, reached out weakly toward Buddy. "Don't let him get sick because of me," she whispered. "Please don't let Buddy die." As they prepared to leave, Dr. Reynolds pulled Jenny aside, his skepticism warring with the evidence he'd witnessed. "Mrs. Miller, I need you to understand something. Emma Sterling arrived here tonight with multiple organ failure and brain death indicators that suggested she had hours to live. Her current condition, while still critical, shows improvement that I cannot explain using any known medical framework. And if that bear is somehow facilitating these changes, he may be absorbing or redirecting Emma's pathology in ways that could kill him." The doctor's voice carried the weight of professional concern overriding personal incredulity. "I don't know how, and I don't know why, but that animal may have just sacrificed his own life to save a dying child." The ride home took place in tense silence, Katie holding Buddy's increasingly limp form, while Jenny drove with the desperate speed of someone racing against time. By the time they reached their house, Buddy was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and his body temperature dangerously elevated. As Jenny carried the cub into their home, she realized that their miracle was about to become a tragedy, and the weight of responsibility for both Emma's recovery and Buddy's decline might destroy everything they'd tried to build. The revelation came at dawn, delivered by Officer Sarah Chen with trembling hands and a manila folder that would change everything the Miller family believed about Buddy's origins. Jenny had spent the night in the sunroom, monitoring Buddy's increasingly labored breathing, while Katie curled up beside the cub, refusing to leave his side despite her parents' gentle insistence that she needed rest. "Jenny," Sarah said quietly from the doorway, her usual professional composure cracked by exhaustion and something deeper, a haunted quality that spoke of discoveries too disturbing to process easily. "I need to show you something. It's about Luna, about where Buddy really came from." Bobby appeared with coffee and the hollow-eyed look of a man who'd spent the night watching his daughter grieve for a dying animal. "Sarah, unless this is urgent, it is." Sarah's voice carried an authority that made both adults pay attention. She opened the folder with hands that shook slightly, revealing photographs, medical records, and official documents marked with stamps that indicated federal oversight. "I've been investigating Blue Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary since the day Buddy showed up here. What I found should have been reported years ago." The first photograph showed a pristine laboratory facility that looked nothing like the rustic wildlife sanctuary the public knew. Sterile white walls, sophisticated monitoring equipment, and rows of containment units that were clearly designed for research rather than rehabilitation. The second photograph made Jenny's stomach lurch. A pregnant black bear in a medical restraint system, IVs running into her sedated form while technicians in biohazard suits monitored banks of equipment. "That's Luna," Sarah said quietly. "This was taken 8 months ago, 3 days before she died." Katie stirred from her position beside Buddy, her pale face turning toward the adults with the acute attention that serious illness had taught her to pay to any medical discussion. "What were they doing to Buddy's mama?" Sarah knelt to Katie's level, her expression gentling despite the grimness of her revelation. "They were trying to understand why some animals seem to help sick people feel better. But instead of just watching and learning, they were doing experiments." Jenny's veterinarian training allowed her to interpret the medical equipment in the photographs with horrifying clarity. "They were inducing labor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Luna wasn't ready to give birth, but they forced it." "Why?" Bobby asked, though his tone suggested he feared the answer. Sarah turned to another page, revealing documents that detailed something called Project Empathy, a joint research initiative between Blue Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary and Sterling Pharmaceuticals. The project's stated goal was to identify and isolate the neurochemical mechanisms that allowed certain animals to provide therapeutic benefits to humans suffering from terminal illnesses. "Doctor," Sterling knew, Jenny said, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. "He's been funding this research for years. That's how he knew to find us so quickly." The documents revealed a pattern of systematic cruelty disguised as scientific inquiry. Luna had been captured specifically because she'd shown unusual responsiveness to human distress during previous encounters with park rangers. Her pregnancy had been monitored not for her health, but for the opportunity it presented to study whether her apparent empathic abilities might be genetically transmissible. "According to these records," Sarah continued, "Luna died during an emergency cesarean section performed without adequate anesthesia. The first cub died within hours of birth. Buddy survived, but barely." Katie's voice was small and filled with a sadness that seemed too large for her 9-year-old frame. "So Buddy watched his mama die, and his brother too?" "Yes, honey. And then he spent his first months of life in that laboratory, being tested and monitored while the researchers tried to understand his abilities. The final photographs showed Buddy as a tiny cub, no more than a few weeks old, connected to monitoring equipment in what was clearly a medical isolation unit. His eyes, even in the grainy surveillance photos, carried the same wounded intelligence that had struck Jenny from their first meeting. "How did he escape?" Bobby asked. "Fire," Sarah replied grimly. 3 months ago, an electrical malfunction caused a containment system failure and a significant blaze. In the chaos of evacuation, several animals escaped. Most were recaptured within days. Buddy made it to the mountains and survived alone until he found your family." Jenny looked at the cub lying motionless beside Katie, his breathing so shallow it barely moved his small chest. "He's been carrying trauma this whole time, physical and emotional trauma that we never understood." "There's more," Sarah said, her voice growing even more quiet. "The research notes indicate that Buddy's interactions with humans cause him to experience something called empathic absorption. When he helps someone feel better, he's not just providing comfort, he's literally taking their physical and emotional pain into his own body." The room fell silent except for Buddy's labored breathing and the distant sound of construction equipment working on the facility that now seemed more like a monument to exploitation than a sanctuary for healing. "That's why he's been getting sicker," Katie said with the clear logic of childhood. "Every time he helps someone, he gets a little bit of their hurt, and now he has too much hurt inside him." Jenny reached out to stroke Buddy's head, her heart breaking as she realized the depth of sacrifice this small animal had been making, not just for Katie, not just for Emma Sterling, but for every desperate person who had sought his touch over the past weeks. "Dr. Sterling knew this would happen," she said, anger building in her voice. "He knew that using Buddy to help Emma would likely kill him, and he asked us to do it anyway." Bobby's expression darkened with a rage that his naturally gentle nature rarely displayed. "That son of a bitch used us. He used our daughter's illness and our desperation to get access to an animal he'd already traumatized through years of experiments." "It gets worse," Sarah said, turning to the final section of documents. "Sterling Pharmaceuticals has filed patents on several synthetic compounds they've developed based on Buddy's blood chemistry. If those patents are approved, they'll own the exclusive rights to manufacture pharmaceutical versions of whatever's causing these healing effects." The enormity of the betrayal settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. Jenny realized that everything, Dr. Sterling's concerned grandfather act, his offer to build a facility, his promise to protect Buddy's welfare, had been calculated manipulation designed to give him ongoing access to an animal whose blood and tissue could be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "What about Emma?" Katie asked. "Is she really getting better, Or is that fake too? Sarah's expression softened slightly. Emma's improvements are real, sweetheart. But they're coming at the cost of Buddy's life, just like your improvements over the past weeks have been costing him his health. The implications hit Jenny like a physical blow. Katie's remarkable recovery from leukemia, the improvement in her blood work, the return of her energy and appetite, the hope that had bloomed in their family for the first time in years, all of it had been purchased with Buddy's gradual decline. So every day that Katie gets better, Buddy gets sicker? Bobby asked. According to the research notes, yes. The animals in Sterling's program showed consistent patterns of health deterioration corresponding to the medical improvements in the humans they interacted with. Katie looked down at Buddy with tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know I was making him sick." Jenny gathered both Katie and Buddy into her arms, feeling the weight of impossible decisions settling on her shoulders. If they continued allowing Buddy to interact with sick people, he would eventually die from the accumulated burden of absorbed suffering. But if they stopped, Katie's cancer would likely return, Emma Sterling would probably die, and hundreds of desperate families would lose their source of hope. "There has to be another way," Bobby said, though his voice lacked conviction. Sarah closed the folder and looked at the family with compassion that transcended her official role. "Jenny, there is one more thing. The research indicates that if Buddy stops using his abilities, if he's allowed to rest and recover without any human interaction, his health should gradually return to normal. And the people he's been helping would likely revert to their previous conditions." Katie lifted her head from Buddy's still form, her young face set with a determination that reminded Jenny of her own stubborn courage in the face of medical impossibilities. "Then that's what we have to do," she said firmly. "We have to let Buddy get better, even if it means I get sick again." The nobility of her daughter's sacrifice broke something fundamental in Jenny's chest, but she also recognized the wisdom in Katie's words. They had unknowingly been party to Buddy's exploitation, and now they had the opportunity to choose his welfare over their own desperate needs. The question was whether they would have the strength to make that choice, and whether Dr. Sterling would allow them to. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of what had once been their sunroom and was now officially designated as Buddy's recovery space. The bear cub, now significantly larger and healthier, stretched contentedly in a patch of golden light while Katie sat nearby, sketching his portrait with hands that trembled only slightly from her latest round of chemotherapy. Jenny watched from the doorway, marveling at the transformation in both child and animal. Buddy's coat had regained its glossy sheen. His movements were once again quick and playful, and his eyes had lost the haunted quality that had marked his first months with their family. Katie, while physically diminished by her cancer's return, seemed to have found a peace that had eluded her during their desperate chase for miraculous healing. "He's gotten so big," Katie observed, adding careful shading to Buddy's ears in her drawing. "Remember when he was small enough to sleep on my lap?" "I remember," Jenny replied, settling into the chair beside her daughter. The past 6 months had been among the hardest of their lives, but also among the most meaningful. The decision to prioritize Buddy's welfare over their own desperate needs had cost them dearly. Katie's remission had ended within weeks of ceasing the healing sessions, but it had also restored something they hadn't realized they'd lost: their integrity. The legal battle with Dr. Sterling had been swift and decisive once Sarah Chen's evidence reached federal investigators. Sterling Pharmaceuticals faced criminal charges for conducting illegal animal experiments, and Dr. Sterling himself was under investigation for fraud and animal cruelty. The hastily constructed facility had been converted into a legitimate wildlife rehabilitation center, run by Sarah Chen and staffed by veterinarians committed to actual animal welfare rather than exploitation. Mrs. Miller? A voice from the front door interrupted Jenny's reflection. She looked up to see Emma Sterling, now 5 years old and accompanied by her mother, rather than her grandfather. Emma's neuroblastoma had returned as expected once her contact with Buddy ceased, but she was responding well to conventional treatments that Dr. Sterling's pharmaceutical company, now under new management, provided free of charge to families affected by their illegal research program. "Emma!" Katie called out, carefully setting aside her sketch pad. "Come see how big Buddy's gotten." The reunion between the two children and the bear was gentle and joyful, marked by the kind of easy affection that had nothing to do with miraculous healing and everything to do with genuine friendship. Buddy approached Emma with his characteristic calm, allowing her to pet his head while he sniffed at her hands with obvious recognition and pleasure. "He remembers me," Emma said with delight. "Of course he does," Katie replied. "Friends always remember each other." Emma's mother, Dr. Sterling's daughter-in-law, approached Jenny with an expression of gratitude mixed with shame. "Mrs. Miller, I wanted to thank you again for what you did, for choosing to protect Buddy even when it meant Katie's cancer came back." Jenny nodded, accepting the thanks while watching her daughter and Emma play with Buddy in the afternoon sunlight. "We learned something important," she said quietly. "Love isn't about keeping someone safe from all suffering. Sometimes it's about making sure they're free to choose their own path." The three families, Miller, Sterling, and Chen, had formed an unlikely bond forged by their shared experience with Buddy and their commitment to his welfare. They gathered monthly for barbecues and birthday parties, their children growing up together while Buddy served as a beloved family pet rather than a miraculous healer. Harold Thompson appeared in the doorway, moving carefully but under his own power, his arthritis managed through conventional treatment and the kind of hope that came from genuine human connection rather than magical intervention. Margaret O'Sullivan followed, her cancer in remission thanks to an experimental treatment funded by the settlement money from the Sterling lawsuit. "Time for dinner," Harold announced with a smile. Margaret made her famous pot roast, and I brought apple pie. As the extended family gathered around their dinner table, Buddy settled beneath Katie's chair with the contentment of an animal who was simply loved rather than needed for miracles. Katie reached down to scratch his ears, her smile radiant despite her physical frailty. "Thank you, Buddy," she whispered, "for teaching us that the best kind of healing happens when nobody has to hurt for it." Outside, the Blue Ridge Mountains stretched toward the horizon, and somewhere in those forests, other wild animals lived their lives free from human interference, exactly as nature intended. The greatest miracle, Jenny realized, hadn't been the healing at all. It had been learning to love without conditions, to hope without desperation, and to find joy in the simple presence of those who mattered most. Dear friends, if you're reading this story as someone who's watched grandchildren battle illness, supported adult children through impossible choices, or faced your own health challenges in your golden years, you know that real miracles aren't always about magical healing. They're about the courage to love without conditions, even when love requires sacrifice. The Miller family's journey with Buddy reminds us that sometimes the greatest gift we can give isn't fixing someone's pain, but sitting with them through it. At 55, 60, or 68, you've learned that life doesn't always offer fairy tale endings, but it does offer something more precious: the wisdom to recognize that genuine love means choosing someone else's well-being over our own comfort. Katie's decision to let Buddy heal rather than continue using him for her own recovery reflects the kind of selfless love that grandparents show every day, putting their family's needs ahead of their own dreams. The story's true miracle isn't supernatural healing. It's the discovery that when we love without expecting anything in return, we create the conditions for everyone to thrive authentically. That's a lesson worth remembering in every relationship, every family decision, and every moment when we choose grace over desperation. What moment in your own life taught you that true love sometimes means letting go? Have you ever had to choose between your own needs and someone else's well-being? And how did that choice change you?